prolific, a prolific writer on ancient philosophy, on Socrates in particular. He's written and edited a remarkable array of books, including two huge companions, one of Socrates in the tradition from Aristotle to Gkatzaras, and one on Plato in medieval Europe, both extraordinarily interesting volumes, large and exhaustive. He himself has worked on Socrates himself. His most recent book is on sôphrosunê, which he interestingly translates as discipline. And his most fascinating book, for me personally, is Calling Philosophers' Names, which is, as he puts it, a study of the word philosophy, not the institution of philosophy itself, and which has coined one of the great terms of the early 21st century, namely the translation of philosophos as wise man wannabe, which I think is a terrific idea. And the book is really worth consulting for anyone who's interested in ancient philosophy, whatever period it is. So, Chris, so to speak, welcome to Athens. I wish I was there with you. And we are very eager to hear you. Ladies and gentlemen, Christopher Moore.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. Is my mic being picked up? Hopefully. Okay, good. Well, thanks so much. Thanks so much to Alexander and also to Thanassis and Xanthippe for the introduction. I'm still rather astonished to have been invited to a sequence of workshops by all the people I'd like to hear on the dialogue. And I'm delighted to be doing so, especially since I'm really starting to get into the Republic. It's a pretty bewildering dialogue.
I forgot to say what you're talking about. I'm sorry.
Who knows? I'll just get into it. We'll just get into it, because what I'm talking about is what Dimitri Elmira talked about on May 7th. So I feel quite vindicated in my choice. And I'd even thought about saving paper or data rates or something like that and just recycling his handout. So it's about the beginning of Republic 6, culminating in 487a, where Socrates says that the philosopher leaders, philosopher guards, will have good qualities beyond the 4 parts, implicitly, of arete that have been discussed in Book 4. That's to say, beyond sophia, andreia, sôphrosunê, and dikaiosunê, and these additional 4 are at least mnemne, eumatheia, megalopropeia, and eucharia. I don't think there's any harm in returning to that passage, and I think there's some interesting stakes for the history of ethics, which is actually my primary concern. So I'm going to recall that Dimitri said that the familiar Book 4 quad are, as a group, virtues, but that he did not know what to call the second additional Book 6 quad as a group, and I think he suggested qualities. I was relieved to hear his uncertainty, because that's where I place my intervention. So in brief, I think that all 8 belong to the same category. They're all being countenanced as parts or aspects or instances of arete, and aspects at a shared level of generality and realization. The latter 4 not being treated as subsidiary subparts or as preliminaries. They're just different ways of being good, and a really good person is good in all these ways. Now, that, I think, seems to track our basic moral intuitions, and given that's the case, why would this be an interpretation worth taking a red eye to Athens? Why would Dimitri have even made a note about it? And I think, well, the answer is easy. The history of Platonic virtue ethics, and in particular the passage in Book 4 at 427e, makes it complicated. This is the key source for the world historical idea that, according to Plato, there are 4 and only 4 virtues. So this I include on the handout. I suppose that our city, if it's been really founded correctly, is completely good. Inevitably, Glaucon said, then clearly it's sophos, andreios, sophron, and dikaios. Clearly. Then, whichever of them we find in it, what's left will be what hasn't yet been discovered. Yeah, that's right, says Glaucon. So Socrates makes two inferences that Glaucon accepts. He first enumerates the content of the adverb completely, and then he advances the method I call finding the remainder. So we can formulate the two inferences in the fashion that is on the handout. If a city is agathe, it is also at least sophia, andreia, sophron, and dikaia. Second, if a city is agathe, it is also only sophia, andreia, sophron, and dikaia. I want to go through these two in turn before we return to the book 6 passage. I fear that both inferences are ungrounded or tendentious, especially when seen against the background of Plato's other dialogues, late 5th and early 4th century thought, and the Republic itself. This is sometimes barely recognized in the scholarship, but never with any detail or precision. So, as for the first one, this may well be true, but it's definitely not an intuitive gloss on a completely good city. I'd expect for a completely good city to be described with terms like eunomos, euporos, eubulos, hesukos, and so on, as there are. Now, to be sure, nothing blocks Socrates' analysis. A city could be called courageous, and I think there's some instances, but obviously Socrates is listing terms that are frequently ascribed to a person that are only in principle ascribable to a city. Now, the force of Socrates' inference seems to be this. If a city is completely good, it can be said to have any and every quality that's good for a city. There's an innumerable number of ways, such ways, and accordingly, Socrates gives only the 4 that will help his argument about the soul and have deep significance. That Glaucon accepts this tendentious or ad hoc list so carelessly is, well, too bad or whatever. So now, as for the second inference, it's also not intuitive, I think, but it's worse in that it's conceivably false. But this reconstruction takes a little bit of argument. My claim is that the method of finding the remainder works only if the items you're sorting through have 2 features. That's mutual exclusivity and joint exhaustiveness. My reasoning is that this is what happens in the likely source domain for the method, geometry, though surely also in forensic explanation. So if I know that some area A is entirely and only constituted by mutually exclusive regions Wx, Y, and Z, and then I find regions W, X, and Y, I can be sure that whatever is left is Z. So you will see my airplane drawings, or drawing on an airplane. This is area A, seems to be no problem. But if there are additional potential regions, and so the 4 are not exhaustive, or if areas can coincide, and so the 4 are not mutually exclusive, then either we cannot non-arbitrarily identify Z with the remainder, or indeed the very idea of a remainder is undermined, and that's areas. I have this in area B and C, confusing cases. Now, I have searched, and yet I find no argument from Socrates before or even after this passage on the exclusiveness or exhaustiveness of these 4 modes of goodness, the ones stipulated in 427. Indeed, plenty of dialogues encourage thinking that the parts arete have the opposite status, Protagoras and Gorgias most vibrantly. If Socrates in Republic 4 supposes something else, we might expect an argument. Why? Well, because it's a central move in defining dikaiosunê, which is an important task in the Republic. Finding the remainder is supposed to clinch the case that dikaiosunê is doing one's own things. Now, given the dubiousness of both inferences, I allege that Socrates is being rhetorical. It's hard not to think of, say, Gorgias's 4 and only 4 reasons for Helen's having gone to Troy. Now, by calling Socrates' remark rhetorical, I mean that neither he nor Plato should be taken as committed to or teaching what Glaucon agrees to, namely that the parts of virtues are precisely these four mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive qualities. To be sure, much of the history of philosophy has taken the passage oppositely as fundamental Platonic doctrine. I won't demonstrate that today, though of course we could talk about many instances. Socrates' lack of argument is typically defended in one of two ways. There's the virtues realism view, let's say. There just are four main virtues, and those main virtues are exclusive and exhaustive. This view assumes that Plato articulates an independent reality. The other view looks to later parts of Republic for itself. This is what I would call the psychic structure justification, the account of the homologous structures of the city and the soul, which has independent justification, somehow in this view necessitates that there be these four and only these four virtues. Now, I believe that both responses are quite bad, philologically inaccurate in the first case, and strainedly credulous in the second. I think they're probably influenced after a fashion by Agathon's rhetorical presentation of the four virtue parts in the Symposium. I don't mean by the Symposium came first and Plato was convinced by his own Agathon, but that mode of presentation, and similarly in perhaps a relatedly vague way by Protagoras' belief in the homology between virtue parts and parts of the face, which are diverse and distinctive sensory capacities. But be that as it may, this evening I want to focus only on the first response, that there really are only these four virtues or virtue parts. Hence the focus on the opening of Book 6, where there look to be more than four. I note that the Book 6 passage is not just my arbitrary contrast case for the Book 4 passage. The two passages are linked closely together narratively. Book 4 develops the view of civic and psychic justice, which depends on the finding the remainder method. In Book 5, Socrates digresses to the realizability of the city, of the just city. He ends up with the proposal of philosophers as leaders of the city, but philosophers are prima facie absurd as leaders. Yet, as he begins Book 6 by arguing, actually, they have all the qualities you could want in a leader as a consequence of that very philosophicality. In a sense, they are completely good. So, while I'm interested, like Dimitri, in the particular 8, or actually more, qualities ascribed to the philosophers here, for the sake of today's argument, I'm interested in this passage as a wedge against inferences to be drawn from the Book 4 passage. Now, the bigger picture is this. I think Plato, throughout his career, is pretty aphoretic about what he and I think is a strange idea, there being a specific number, an independent psychological status of arete, goodnesses, excellences, virtues. I really don't think he's confident that there are these precise four distinctive parts of virtue, even if the familiar four are typical ways of being good, or speaking of a person's being good. While demands of compression lead him to write as though there are four, sometimes demands of expansion lead him to write as though there are more, or a different set. At any rate, my interest in the history of ethics is, to put it in highfalutin language, in the mereology of goodness, the idea that there are ways of being good that could add up to complete goodness. And I think the Platonic dialogues mostly take that issue as a puzzle and not something that's solved. And we see that even in the waning pages of Laws 12. Okay, so since not all of you were here for Dimitri's presentation or have his handout at hand, I want to start by revisiting those first couple of pages of Book 6. There, Socrates is arguing for the qualities natural to a philosopher who seeks a grasp of a reality, but a philosopher will also need to be suited for guarding and preserving the existing laws, as Socrates says. Thus, Socrates argues that both sets of qualities, namely the philosophical ones and the guard-related ones, are compatible. But he does not do this in a kind of pairwise fashion, that we see in the Protagoras. Instead, he shows that a single quality, a certain desire for knowledge, entails all the others. Now, the reasoning he deploys is often compressed, it's curious, it's even doubtful in many instances, and I flag that as important, but I really have tried hard, exercise sôphrosunê, not to get bogged down in the many interesting difficulties here. So, if you have the handout, that's great. In a sense, I don't really want to read through it. I don't really want to reconstruct the argument, but let's use it as a visual guide. I have put in bold terms which are typically thought of as names of virtue parts. Truth, not itself, but is standing in for sophia, I suppose. There is sôphrosunê, there's megaloprepeia, which might be presented as the opposite of being stingy or petty in the previous line. There is courage, there's decency, being cosmos. There is justice and gentleness, sharpness, umathes, being nomnonikos, having good memory. There's the kind of moderateness and being eucharis, being engaging or charming or cultivated or something like that. I have highlighted 11 terms that I think take the status as virtue part terms. Also, just so you understand this outline, with further, I've shown independent inferences, so to speak, from the starting condition, namely being a desirer of the whole of truth. Thus, Socrates concludes, they are retentive, sharp, generous, engaging, and a friend and intimate of truth, justice, courage, and discipline. So Socrates has argued that desiring philosophical knowledge and being able to satisfy that desire requires the same capacities that doing other things in life requires. Leading a city falls in this doing other things category, as would other activities. In the process, he has argued that philosophers would avoid the traits what we might imagine are often ascribed to guards, especially mercenary guards, but that's a separate issue. So let me draw a sequence of observations from this passage. So first, the conclusion presents, so to speak, the original tetrad and the additional tetrad. Socrates does not say that the additional tetrad are the qualities distinctive of philosophers. That's despite there being consequences of specifically the desire for wisdom. Well, because of course the members of the original tetrad are also presented as consequences of the desire for wisdom. So while the groupings into two groups of four obviously indicates a glance back at book 4 in a certain way, and the 4 parts of virtue already discussed there, does not obviously make a point beyond that. Indeed, second, the burden of the argument was not to show that philosophers have additional parts of virtue or virtues. It was that they have the parts of virtue suitable for guarding the city, or perhaps still have those parts. After all, as members of the guardians, the philosophers already had the qualities suitable for guarding. But if you thought that their preternaturally expanded intellectual virtue might inhibit those other virtue parts, worry not. Their desire for wisdom requires or retains those other virtue parts. But again, the point of this argument is not to enumerate the capacities needed for being philosophical, but for being a guardian of the laws as well. Nevertheless, third, Socrates does bring up these additional 4 virtue parts as virtue parts embodied by the philosophers. In fact, he brings up more than 4, because there's also decency, gentleness, and moderateness. But why does he bring up these 4 or 7? I ask because they don't seem uniquely applicable to philosophers. They don't even sound especially epistemic, even if they're presented as related to knowledge acquisition. Fourth, we have already seen some of these terms in book 3 before any talk of philosopher leaders. Socrates has been describing the knowledge needed for designing an education for the guardians. I believe this is on the bottom of the second page of the handout. We've got to recognize the forms of sôphrosunê and andreia and eleutheriotês and megaloprepeia and whatever siblings of them there are. Now, given these four observations, I can now present my hypothesis. Both tetrads of virtue parts are simply familiar instances of traits appropriate to good citizens who might have leadership roles. The very fact that Socrates argues to them in an indiscriminate mix suggests that all 8 or 11, or whatever, represent qualities stereotypically associated with excellent people, even kalokagathia. That is, you might expect a person to have that range of qualities. I will now go on to try to support this hypothesis from both inside and outside Plato. And once I do that, we can return to the relationship between the book 4 and 6 passages and a new reading of the book 4 passage. So let's start with the Meno. Socrates has asked whether Meno accepts that justice is not arete, but aretetis. Meno is quite confused until Socrates clarifies the contrast, and now he can answer. So it says Meno, I say that not only justice, but other things are virtues too. Socrates, what are they? Tell me. For example, I could list you other shapes if you told me to. So now you tell me other virtues. In that case, says Meno, I think courage is a virtue, and sôphrosunê, and intelligence, and megalopropeia, and a whole lot of others. So Plato's Meno cites some of the stereotypical 4, but he has evidently no notion of there being 4 in particular. He includes megalopropeia as also stereotypical, and then gives this, etc. Later, Socrates lists, on the basis of Meno's initial selection, those qualities of soul that need sophia to be reliably beneficial. So we've yet to consider those things that pertain to the soul. You call something sôphrosunê, and something justice, and courage, and sharpness, and retentiveness, and generosity, and all those sorts of things. Now, here Socrates seems to have filled in some of what he must expect Meno's a whole lot of others to include, while also keeping that list open-ended. So here we have 7 of the octad of virtue parts found in Republic 6, lacking only Gkatzaras, or eukarya. And anyway, I find this remarkable. Now, Meno's done for now. Let's turn to Aristotle. Aristotle's best-known list of virtues in the 2 Ethics runs to a dozen or more entries. To be sure, he starts out with andreia and sôphrosunê, and eventually gives significant attention to dikaiosunê and phronesis, but at no point does he say that those 4 are the virtuous virtues, or that anybody has ever thought they were, even if he thinks some are more impressive than others. More germane to our argument are the 2 passages in the Rhetoric where Aristotle lists what people think of when they're talking about arete or arete. In the earlier of the 2, he is listing what's good, eudaimonia, arete, health, etc. He goes on to decompose arete: justice, courage, discipline, megalosoukia, megalopropeia, and other such states. These are the virtues of the soul. In the second passage, that's at Rhetoric 1:6. In the second passage in Rhetoric 1:9, Aristotle is describing arete and takalon as objects of praise. He decomposes arete again, now without the open-endedness. The parts of virtue: justice, courage, discipline, megalopropeia, megalosoukia, eleutheriotês, phronesis, and sophia. Given the context, the second 1:9 passage might count as a bit more authoritative. Like the Republic 6 conclusion, it has 8 entries, it includes megalopropeia, it has multiple epistemic terms, and it includes eleutheriotês, the negative of the privation, of which the Republic 6 passage includes, and which we saw in Republic 3. So, while Aristotle and Plato's lists are not strictly identical, they are pretty closely matched. Now, the first of the Rhetoric passages, 1:6, is not itself uninteresting. As an epitome, it deems it relevant to include megalosoukia and megalopropeia at the cost of including any epistemic term, but we'll leave that aside for the evening. So now, return to Plato in a bit of an overview way. I'll start by noting the dichotomy between dialogues where the conversation puts piety in its list of core parts of arete, such as Protagoras and Gorgias, and those where it doesn't. such as republican laws. Now, there's never really an argument for the inclusion or exclusion of piety, and so its appearance, and thus a list of 4 versus 5 virtue parts, seems less a matter of settled philosophical views than dialectical pertinence or evolving linguistic practice. And now I deny that the Euthyphro explains anything as by somehow eliminating piety by subordinating it to justice, since in lots of dialogues, various virtue parts are subordinate to other virtue parts, and yet they are survivors. I also want to say what I might have said earlier, that there's no doubt that across the dialogues, Socrates or other interlocutors often treat the familiar 4 or 5 virtue parts as sufficient for talking about the manifold ways of being good. And in fact, there's remarkable stability in this list, which only partially overlap with the other late 5th and early 4th century parallels. But we might expect to find a common stereotyped list, or stable list, of instances of something across the works of an author. And that does not mean that the author believes or asserts that this list is exhaustive, and much less that its parts are mutually exclusive. We happen to find such stereotyped lists in, for instance, Plato's list of the sophists, Protagoras, Gorgias, Prodicus, Hippias. These lists are convenient dialectical starting points, and not necessarily to be taken as of deeper significance than that. And I mean, I can note parenthetically that that tetrads have a very strong cognitive presence in Greek thought. Now, the Cratylus breaks the stereotype. I refer to the section where Socrates provides etymological justifications of the names of virtue parts. So this is going to, they have a list on the 3rd page, but before he goes through them, he says, and having dealt with that type, namely the gods' names, I'd like to consider these fine names concerning arete in respect to their having been established correctly. For instance, phronesis, sunesis, dikaiosunê, and all the others of that sort. So now on the handout, we have this list of phronesis, nome, noesis, sôphrosunê, episteme, sunesis, sophia, tagathon, dikaiosunê, andreia, and arete itself. Oh, I don't want to speak in any detail about this here, except to mention what you all have noticed. It's a pretty long list of parts or aspects or whatever, just of virtue. It favors epistemic terms without giving any justification for that preference and without omitting any of the stereotyped 4. Okay. Before we return to Republic, I want to talk about one more passage or work, and that's Xenophon's Agesilaus. So Xenophon's praise of Agesilaus, presumably written just after the general's death in 360, falls into 3 parts. There's praise of his deeds, there's praise of the arete in his soul, and then there's a summary of that aretaic praise in sections 10 and 11. Here I list the qualities of soul arete Xenophon dilates on, and the chapter and section right here being at the bottom of page 3 of the handout. In angle brackets, I include terms in Greek or English for the qualities described but not specified. So eusebeia, a sort of inflected mode of dikaiosunê, Cartrian and Krateia, andreia, sophia, Philopolis, tauchari, megalo, nomosunê, and pronoia, and then basically autarkeia. I have 5 comments here. First, there are about 10 virtue parts here, which numerically puts us in the ballpark of Aristotle's ethics list and the full accounting of the Republic 6 passage. Second, sôphrosunê does not appear as the name of a general category, but it does appear as a term in the Carteria and Krateia section. Elsewhere, however, in a 4-item epitome of Agesilaus' good qualities, this is in 10, Xenophon mentions Agesilaus being Theosebes, Dikaios, Sophron, and Encrates. So he is resolved to simplified 4 as well. Third, megalonomosunê is hapax in Xenophon, and it seems to be the same as Aristotle's megalosoukia. Fourth, Socrates uses the term Philopolis in Republic Book 6 when summarizing the character of the guardians. They must have shown through trial and adversity that they are philopolitides. He has also used the term once earlier in the Greeks and barbarians passage to describe a hatred for civil strife. So Xanthippe and Plato end up using it in the same way. Finally, and fifth is ta euchari. So Eucharis appears in Plato only in our book 6 passage. It is never even recapitulated. It's a very uncommon word, having, as far as I can tell, no X and 5th century non-epithetic uses. But it appears again twice in the Cyropedia, once linked with being asteos, urbane and charming, and another time in the praise of a Persian general whom Cyrus admired. Now, I'm especially impressed by 2 grave inscriptions from Delos, probably from the 4th century, where the primary quality remembered of some man is his having been a Eucharis leader. For those following CEG 836 and 837. So I didn't include those on the handout. Xenophon's description of Agesilaus in chapter 8 treats him as neither, this is in the Eucharis section, treats him as neither haughty nor conceited, despite his evident political power, and in fact quite enjoyable to be around. Sociable, concerned, tolerant. So my inference is that some decades into the 4th century, Eucharis had a moment as a central term in the overall description of good leadership. Now, I've nattered on about this list of virtue parts in the Agesilaus because I think it shows in a pretty normative way how people would celebrate the parts of psychic arete in an all-around leader. It starts with the most familiar or praiseworthy or significant parts: piety, fairness and honesty or moral integrity, self-control or self-discipline, courage, knowledge, and its smart application. But then it continues, and not with something categorically different or an afterthought, but with additional qualities deemed of considerable, if not as considerable importance, connected to civic commitment, affability and sociality, self-respect, insight, and modesty or self-conscientious or conscientious self-reliance. Okay, so now we'll return to our target passage. Well, sort of return, not quite return, because I want to recall that this is not a one-off reference to these virtue parts. We get sequences of recapitulation. This is what we see in the first recapitulation just a few pages later. This is the one at 490. So with truth leading, I don't think we'd ever say that a course of evils would bring up the rear. Oh, how could we? It instead be a sound and just character that follows with sôphrosunê attached to it. That's right. And I'm sure you remembered that it turned out that andreia, megalopropeia, oumatheia, and mnemne belong to them too. This gives 7 of the virtue terms now without Eucharis. The next recapitulation reduces the number further. This is at 494. For we affirmed, didn't we, that oumatheia, mnemne, andreia, and megalopropeia are characteristic of their philosophical nature. Yes. This is slimmed down to an informative but rhetorically convenient hybrid tetrad. When the paradox of guard versus philosopher traits returns in 503, Socrates starts by characterizing the especially intellectual people now with an extended list. The sharp and retentive, the keen and the incisive, and this very incisiveness tells against their stability and courage. Finally, in Book 7, Socrates once more recapitulates this paradox. This is a central and climactic piece of evidence. Socrates says that, and this unfortunately I didn't include on the handout, Socrates says that the stable and courageous need to be, besides being solid and hardy, geneos and blosuros, they need to be intellectually penetrating and sharp, retentive, persistent, and hardworking. It's at 530a BC. At the end, Socrates warns, we've got to check the genuineness of their sôphrosunê and andreia and megalopropeia and all the other parts of arete. I conclude from all this that the qualities in our Republic 6 passage all count as virtue parts, but this should not be a surprising or important finding on its own, even if it is interesting for thinking about early ethical vocabulary. I said that I want to use it against a common interpretation of Republic 4, and that's what I'll conclude my talk with some remarks about. So I said at the talk's opening that I think the method by which Socrates goes about defining justice, starting in Book 4, is of mainly rhetorical value. And I said that there are two main problems. In the first place, there seems to be no reliable way to determine which features of the city should even count as underlying or manifesting some named virtue part. If sôphrosunê has a structural correlate, why not megaloprepeia? And why assume that andreia and sôphrosunê, which are often equated and sometimes treated as differing only in taking pain or pleasure as their objects, would be structurally asymmetrical? One belongs to a single soul part, the other a relationship between two or three soul parts. Or why not assume that the appetitive soul part has some characteristic virtue in the way the two other soul parts do? But I said I'd leave the problems with that correspondence between structure and virtue term problem aside. What I've wanted to focus on is the unargued assumption of the finding the remainder method. That is, that since there are four wholly distinguishable virtue parts, the finding of the three leaves entirely and only one. Much of the history of scholarship has been pretty sympathetic to Socrates' remarks here, though not all of it. Since we're getting on, I will note only two commentators on opposing sides. I include a few more that I was able to fit at the bottom of page 4 on the handout. So I think Dimitri said that R.L. Nettleship's lectures, first published posthumously in 1897, were underrepresented in recent scholarship, so I hereby represent it. He expresses the conventional view. Plato starts with accepted ideas. Goodness itself shows itself in four main forms, the cardinal virtues of the Greeks. Every nation has its own idea of virtue. And the Greeks conceived of complete virtue as showing itself under these four principal aspects. Well, it turns out that he provides no evidence. Nevertheless, he is followed by many, Hackforth and Cornford, and so on. By contrast, here's my one contrasting case. The only commentator I know who makes something like my point, but not the same point, is Paul Shorey in a note in his Loeb Republic. Plato recognizes other virtues even in the Republic, like Eleutheriotès of 402c and megaloprepeia in 536a, excuse me, and would have been as ready to admit that the number 4 was part of his literary machinery as Ruskin was to confess the arbitrariness of his 7 lamps of architecture. It's pretty good. In a further note, Shorey says that Plato recognizes that he's not proving anything by this method, but merely setting forth what he has assumed for other reasons. So, with Shorey, I concur in part and dissent in part. I do think Plato would recognize a certain arbitrariness or inconsistency here. And I agree that Plato would not find Socrates' argument compelling. But I'm not sure literary machinery properly names the reason for the passage, nor, though I don't know exactly what Shorey thinks Plato is setting forth, I assume it's the nature of justice. Do I think that Plato is keen to assert things with misleading or fallacious reasonings? Still, Shorey, better than most other commentators, at least prompts the question, what work is Socrates' appeal to the method of finding the remainder doing? Why is this a rhetorically effective or thematically helpful or dialectically sharp way of defending the idea that justice is doing one's own things? Further, is there any substantive use later in the dialogue for the correlation of virtue parts with sectors of the city or aspects of the soul, or relationships between those sectors or aspects of the soul? That is, does anything rest on it? I don't have time this evening to talk in any detail about these issues. My main point is that throughout the Republic, as in other dialogues and classical texts, the idea that there are 4 jointly exhaustive and mutually exclusive virtue parts is untenable. And so the assumptions underlying the method are untenable. But I do want to at least float a couple considerations one might go on to pursue. When I get to the 6th consideration, we will be done. First, the method as an uninspiring consequence, that is, in its application in Book 4. Sôphrosunê is a relationship between the 3 parts in one respect. Dikaiosune is also a relationship between the 3 parts in a rather similar respect, but somewhat different. Now, from a 5th or 4th century perspective, this should be unsurprising, since those two modes of goodness are frequently linked and surely overlap in many different ways. But from the perspective of the method, it seems to be bad. The distinction seems factitious or tendentious. So it's definitely not a method that made the specialness of justice. It's not a method that would make the specialness of justice especially obvious. Okay, second, I think the method is ocious or precious or somehow redundant. Socrates says that it simply confirms what people already say, either that justice or being just is doing one's own things. No method of elimination was necessary to resolve on that. Third, the method is founded on a principle that is in a certain respect false to Republic I and to its conclusion. In that first book, justice was identified as human arete simpliciter, 335, 348c, 353e. And at the end of the finding remainder discussion, justice is treated as whatever allows for and maintains the other parts of virtue. No comparison with the other modes or parts of goodness was necessary. Fourth, in the discussion of the finding the remainder method, though the constructed city is spoken of as completely good, agathos, in the sequence of argument that follows, Socrates never characterizes courage as an instance of anything in particular. Let me say what I mean by that. He introduces the method as working by having four somethings tinon teteron, so 428a3. When it comes to the cardinals, let's call them, he again speaks of them only as tetera. We know from elsewhere that Socrates is not opposed to speaking of parts of arete, but he doesn't do so here. And it suggests to me that he wants to present the method as more universally applicable than it really is. Presumably, it wouldn't work in all domains. Take the four things I have forgotten. If I remember three of them, I don't for that reason remember the fourth. So if Socrates can avoid specifying the domain of application, he can make the method seem more powerful, more determinate, more diagnostic than it really is. Fifth, some people think that Glaucon is mathematically oriented. If finding the remainder is originally a geometrical method, then Socrates may be appealing persuasively to his interlocutor. If, however, finding the remainder is originally a rhetorical method, then Socrates may be appealing to a persuasive trope in general. Okay, but I'll end with the sixth consideration. Socrates throughout the dialogues, and even, as I mentioned, the Athenian visitor in Laws 12, is pretty harsh on those who would disconnect the parts of virtue, grounding some but not others in expertise or reason or whatever. I wonder if it's pretty clever that in a place where he evinces his interlocutor's commitment to disconnection, that is, mutual exclusion, he is able to come to that same point he always gets to in Book 6, the unity of virtue. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much for this stimulating talk. Now, before we proceed to questions, I would like to ask Alexander Nehamas if he would like to make a comment. We don't hear you. No, so let us proceed to
He's
questions.
muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I said I will just wait and see how it goes. There's no reason for me to start. I enjoyed it very much, but that's it at this point.
Okay, so let us proceed to questions. Where we have questions both from here from the center and from the audience in Zoom. So if you don't mind, I would choose alternately one from the audience here and one from Zoom, okay? So let us first begin from the Zoom. Who is the first? Rachel Barney, please.
Thanks. Hello, Christopher. That was fascinating. Thank you so much. I've many questions, but I'll prod you on the thing that I found least convincing, which wasn't something you said, but something that you didn't discuss, which is the argument that follows the identification of justice in the city. Because at 433, once he's used this, I agree, obviously not a proof argument to identify the principle of specialization with justice. Sorry, it's 434 and following. We get an argument that, look, this factor is very important for the flourishing of the city. It's the only thing which could compete with these other virtues we've identified as being the foundational virtue. So the way I would describe what's going on is he uses sort of any old method. Maybe it's mock geometry, maybe it's just random intuition, but he does any old thing to elicit the thought that the principle of specialization is going to be justice. And then he says, yeah, you know what? It's actually a very strong candidate. And here are the reasons. Because it's the causal factor that preserves the city. So I think you can actually see a shadow of a kind of deep thought, which is, we've got all kinds of commitments to what justice is from the start of the book. It's going to have something about rendering what's due, what's appropriate to each. And there's also this thought, which, you can compare in Rawls, that justice is going to be the chief foundational virtue of a normative political order. And that's the target all along. So yeah, to get there, he uses this. I think what it actually is kind of inference to the best explanation all along, and then we get, and that implies a limited menu of other explanations you can compare it to, right? But then we do get sort of explicit confirmatory argument afterwards. So it doesn't seem to me to be just rhetoric or the articulation of an assumption. It's just that the work is being done at a slightly later moment.
Rachel, that's really nice. But I think what you're saying, though, is that what's important is that justice comes to be argued, Socrates argues that justice is either the curia arete or the curia part of arete on grounds, well, not just on grounds independent of the method. The method wasn't trying to find which is the authoritative or the most important or the signal or the prime virtue or virtue part. And so I think what you're suggesting is that even the four virtue parts, or the tetra that appear in 427, that they are, I could look at you here, but then I'm not looking, anyway, like this, I can actually look at both you and the camera at the same time. So it's silly. That those are like the best competing, the best competitors, the best candidates for the curia arete or the prime arete or something like that. I mean, maybe you're not exactly saying that. That strikes me, though, if you were saying that, to be a view that I would totally agree with. Oh, why? Well, because we see plenty of instances throughout the 5th century of, and also in the 4th century in Platonic dialogues, for each of those others being essentially what arete in general is. I mean, sôphrosunê is presented that way at time in Gorgias. You can imagine andreia, well, I mean, after a fashion in Laws 1. Knowledge, wisdom, for sure, in other places too. So that would be fine. That would be great. Of course, my more trivial point, I think, still stands that we shouldn't see what just happened as Plato's presentation of a reasoned position, namely that there are only four virtue parts, or indeed four virtues, as Plotinus and as one of the editors of the Divisiones Aristoteliae, and everyone else, or many other people in the history of thought have thought.
Can I just, I won't go on forever though, I'm tempted, but yeah, that it seems entirely convincing to me, and I wonder if it isn't a bit of a retrojection of Stoicism back onto Plato, actually, to think, oh, he must have had a complete system, and you should be able to draw a chart that shows exactly how many virtues there are and what gets ranked up under
For
what.
sure. I mean, because we don't see it in Aristotle, we don't even see it in the Platonic Definitions. I mean, there's no I mean, it happens that there's the big four are listed in sequence, but then some other ones are listed with no break and not given a special status. So I think that it strikes me as totally not a thing in early academy, only a thing later on that then is retrojected, as you say.
And just one other point raised by what you were saying. I mean, one fascinating thing is that the selection of virtues, these four, it's not that they're implausible as virtues of a city, even as candidates for the leading virtue of a city, right? You might think, well, the Spartans, they only care about the courage of the city. Certain kind of aristocrat thinks sôphrosunê is what keeps a city healthy. Protagoras is going to think it's wisdom. Most people probably think it's justice. But there are all these, as you pointed out, there are also all these other distinctively political virtues that don't get considered, right? Where's eunomia? Where's homonoia? Where's unity, even as an explicit virtue? And you might think, it seems to me there's two possible explanations here, and I'd be interested to see which you prefer, or if there are others. One would just be, well, this whole thing is to figure out what justice in the soul is, so we're only going to consider virtues that are virtues, plausibly virtues of individual human beings. So eunomia, homonoia, etc., not so plausible. And that would be sort of the boring answer. The more interesting answer, I think, would be that he's actually some kind of methodological individualist in political thought, and thinks that, yeah, the most essential virtues of a city do have to be grounded in the virtues of individuals. That there's no what you might think of as the emergent political virtues, eunomia and so on, those are going to be reducible to the virtues of individual human beings. And I think that's an interesting and plausible idea.
Yeah, that transparency is plausible. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Vasilis Karasmanis. Here.
Oh, yeah, you should use the microphone so they can hear you on the Zoom.
Starting from your diagram at the beginning,
no. Okay.
These two cases. These cases, have to do with, not with city, but with agαθó. So the general formulation should be, for every x, if this x is good, then it has these four things. Because the four virtues have to do with the goodness, and not for the city, which has many other things, a big city, a small city, an oligarchic city, a democratic city, and so on. Just a small second thing before I go to the other is, why do you translate the sôphrosunê as discipline? I cannot understand it. If you could say self-discipline, we are, or self-control, we are better. In Charmides is self-knowledge. And this implies that from self-knowledge, we have also our self-control. Okay, that's it. But the main thing is the following now. What is virtue for Plato, or for you? To every people, you can give some characteristics, some attributes. One is tall, short, fat, white, black, and so on, rich, poor. These attributes have to do with the body. There are other attributes. Someone is clever, someone is just or unjust, or all these things. And from all these characteristics, other are positive, others are negative. So in a vulgar, ordinary sense of the people, the positive characteristics or attributes of the soul are called virtues, and the negative are vices. Do you think that this is Plato's conception in the Republic? So every attribute of the soul, everything, maybe hundreds, I don't know how many, if it is positive, is a virtue. It is a negative, is a vice. So we can enumerate many things. Or it is something stronger philosophically, and in this case, you can have these four, and the other, all the multitude of the other, is derivable of these four. That's my question.
Right. Sorry, I don't have a solid service to take notes. Okay, so sorry, I just, because of the mic thing, I didn't hear the first very well, but I accept that, I mean, what are these diagrams? Who knows? It's about area, area A, B, and C. Let's not put too much weight into it, except my idea is that the intuitiveness of the finding the remainder method works for area A. That would seem to me, in my made-up knowledge of late 5th or early 4th century geometry, to be the kind of thing you're trying to do. Okay, so, yes, okay, so that's it. What?
Not with two, factors, but with four.
Yes, sure.
We remove the three.
Exactly, right. And so I'm just trying to say, like, but there are other possibilities, and you would have to show what hasn't yet been shown. Okay, it's immaterial to the talk why I translated sôphrosunê as discipline, but there is a long story about that. I'm not going to tell the story, but I will say that self-discipline in English often helps specify, perhaps, the type of discipline or being disciplined or the exercise of discipline that I mean. Self-discipline, I think that self-prefix is a kind of aid so that we're not thinking of discipline as the transitive verb to discipline someone. But discipline is also well, in the passive, it is essentially intransitive, to be disciplined. And so I'll just mention, again, in the English context, especially in, let us say, the American educational context, when one asks students about what qualities they would like to have, what qualities they admire, what qualities seem central to a good life, you have already the prototype of the disciplined athlete, of the disciplined scholar, of the disciplined entrepreneur. That's the person who identifies a long-term goal and is not distracted by the short-term stuff. That is able to stay committed to what they take to be a more important call on their attention than the other hurly-burly that comes up. And now I think that in the 5th century, sôphrosunê, sophronen, being sophron, is used in precisely that way, as the capacity to maintain practical commitment to something which could be distracted by, short-term, more intense desires. So discipline strikes me as the way that people describe that phenomenon. But that, again, is ancillary. Now, what is arete? Well, that's the nominal of being agathos. What is being agathos? It's being good. What is that? Big question. I mean, the question for the human condition and for ethics and so forth. So, I mean, what I'm particularly interested in, as I said, I'm interested in the history of ethical theorization. I'm interested in how it came to be, one, that you could speak of arete in the plural. I mean, it's really weird to do that. And it's almost never done. It's not, absolutely not, but it's very rarely done in the 5th century and quite rarely done even in Plato. And as we saw from the 2 rhetoric cases, even Aristotle, writing the Rhetoric, is at that cusp where you speak of a part of arete and you speak of arete. You know, and I can remember the time when in English, water went from a mass noun to a count noun. I'd like 3 waters, please. There was a time before which that was not used, and it sounds weird even today, but you can say that. So I think what we see in Plato across his works is a kind of reflection of changing linguistic practices in the early 4th century. Because it's true that, I should have included this passage in the handout, there is one moment somewhere in book 7, I'm sure all you online know exactly what this passage is, but it's where Socrates is distinguishing sophia from, he says, from the other so-called arete teisukes or something like that. And so the legomena itself, or columina, or whatever it's called, or whatever he says, even to me is suggesting that he's saying, like, yeah, this is sort of a new way of talking, the virtues of the soul. Now, speaking about psychological virtues, teisukes, I mean, that's also a phenomenon that's happening also in the 380s, 370s, as you see in Isocrates and so forth. But, I mean, my basic answer or response to your question is like, yes, actually, I think that the question, what is agathos, what is arete, how can we be thinking of it having parts or aspects or modes or instantiations or varieties? That's what's going on. That's what I'm curious about. I think it's not settled in the Republic. I think it's also not settled in the laws. Because I think in book 12, it's like, oh, there's these things we speak of as 4, but we sort of think of them as 1. But maybe there's an innumerable number of them. Actually, if you want to be a serious person, this is the problem to work on. Anyway, so that's what I'm doing.
Okay, let's go back to the Zoom audience. Next question is from Gail Fine.
Hi, am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. I wondered what you thought of the following line of argument that Melissa Lane and Dominic Scott, for example, defend, which is that Plato distinguishes between a philosopher and someone who has a philosophical nature, but isn't yet a philosopher. And they think that these other things which you take to be genuine virtues are things that the aspiring philosopher has. You have them when you're young, and they might become virtues, but until you've developed a certain way and acquire knowledge and various other things, that's not actually virtue. And so they would defend the claim that therefore virtues, meaning these are full-fledged virtues, whereas the other things that you're counting as parts of virtue are something like proto-virtues. And I assume that's why Dimitri wanted to talk about qualities, because he was thinking that these other traits are just proto-virtues. They're traits that people can have before they become philosophers, but until they acquire knowledge and are more developed, they aren't actually virtues.
Yeah,
and
thanks.
actually, the 3 of the passages that you cite from book 6 on page 4 of your handout, Plato mentions the philosophical nature. I think you translated it as the nature of a philosopher, as opposed to having a philosophical nature, which can fall short of actually being a philosopher. So I don't know if you think that distinction is important to Plato, and if it's important, whether that's the importance that it has, or part of the importance that it has.
Yeah, thanks, Gail, for asking that. I was talking to a friend of mine on Friday, and he said, that's the question. The question you asked is the question I'm going to get, because I'm totally blithe about it. Because I think, because I think it's not a distinction that's at play. And here's sort of the very rough reason for that is because of the intermixing of these terms at many different points. So for example, the Republic 3 passage, the way that andreia is sometimes getting stuck in the groups, like in the top of page 4 in the 490c passage, andreia is getting stuck down with these other ones. So first, I mean, that's just the kind of observation about the kind of looseness and intermixing of the language, of the terms. And I mean, similarly, one could say, but perhaps not very convincingly, that in the argument at the beginning of book 6, 484 to 487, the way that they're mixed together, that is the original 4 and the other ones, makes it difficult to see that that distinction is operating at that point. But that's the loose. The stronger thing is I just don't see an argument for that distinction. I mean, I don't want to just say like, well, I think that's retrojection of Aristotelian natural virtue versus developed virtue. But I don't see that there's talk of certain things being just part of the physis or the physes of the philosophoi physes. I just don't see there being a reasoned explanation for some being developed, but also not natural and developed, and some not going to that stage. And indeed, it strikes me, but of course I'm biased, that that's a just so argument to try to preserve the special status of the 4, but I don't think that there's anything in this discussion of the 4 in 427 that would lead us to believe that they somehow are the things which are matured and the other ones are preliminary or something like that. So yeah, I mean, so the basic point is I think it's a just so distinction. I mean, but can I, before Alexander, before you, I mean, but I do want to acknowledge that I think in relation to what I was saying to Rachel, I think that for various reasons connected to ways people talk in the 5th century, especially if you look at the epitaphic record, there are certain terms which just seem more significant to people. Sôphrosunê, arete, eventually being dikaios, eventually some of the intellectual terms. And so I think it's better to say, I mean, I would prefer to say that the big 4 are not somehow distinctive ontogenetically, that they're the ones that continue into proper adulthood, but that they're distinctive for being just more significant in the practice of ethical critique.
Just one little follow-up to that. In supporting your view, you mentioned, for example, Aristotle's Rhetoric as support and common views. Of course, to that one might say, yeah, but this is Plato's Republic, and maybe he has a different view, and you can't just assume that he's taking over ordinary views. Maybe he's criticizing them or has different views.
Yep.
So I would say that appealing even to other Platonic dialogues like the Meno, which is earlier, or Xenophon or Aristotle's Rhetoric, isn't good support for your view. It might be better support, but still not decisive, to focus on Aristotle's ethical works. And as you said there, he does give some kind of priority to the 4. Whether he counts all these other things as also being arete is another question. But even if he did, that could be a different view from Plato. So
right. Oh, I'm sorry to cut you off, Gail, but Aristotle, somehow I think this is important. Aristotle never says, oh, but there's a view by the friends of the forums that there are only 4 virtues, and I'm going to argue against that. Because that, if he thought that was, I mean, he's read the Republic, he seems not to think that that's the view, and it's not a view to be responding to. I mean, so it's a kind of argument from silence, granted, but strikes me that if all of a sudden, in only one book, book 4, of one dialogue, the Republic, we had this very distinctive view. It might be worth talking about. So, but I appreciate that. I mean, why I tried to argue principally from Republic 6 against 4 is for the reason that you suggested, that, of course, there's a big philosophical project going on in the Republic. And it would be nice, qua philosopher, for a big, important, different view to be given an argument, and I just don't think it is.
Thank you.
Okay, please, Alexander.
Could I sort of cut in before Jessica, because I want to talk about this particular issue that Gail and Whitney have raised. I think there's a difference between 4 and 6. And in a funny way, it goes back all the way back to Bernard Williams' paper in the Vlastos Festschrift about whether the analogy works or not. The question is, do the 4 virtues that we have in book 4 specify what I might call perfect virtue or not? And my sense is that they don't. They don't have to do with younger people or earlier stages. They have to do with all the members of the city. Note that the 4 virtues are all dependent on dikaiosunê, right? Because if they intermix with one another, it's kakurgia, he says, whereas dikaiosunê makes them functional right. I think that structure of the soul is a structure of the soul of all the citizens of the Kallipolis. The difference being that the artisan's reason is subordinated to the philosopher's reason. And that's back in 596 or something like that. Not 596, but way towards the end of book 8, 9. Now, the virtues in the 6th book are derived in a funny way from the love of truth. It's the pursuit of truth that requires the other virtues that are being discussed here. So here's my suggestion. The 4 so-called cardinal virtues are the virtues that are necessary for every citizen in the Republic. The other virtues that are discussed in 6 are simply the additional virtues that the philosopher-guardians have that make them distinguishable from the rest of the citizens and capable of running the city. That's just a suggestion. You can take it or leave it. Thank you. And sorry, Jessica.
I'll just note that's kind of the reverse of what Melissa Lane and Dominic Scott want to argue. They think things like being gentle and so on are the virtues that you can have when you merely have a philosophical nature, whereas justice and so on are things that only philosophers with knowledge have. That's not to say you're right or wrong, but just to note the distinct fact that the complete opposite of what they want to argue.
Okay, thank you. The next one, I would like, if you don't mind, to give the floor to Georgia Sulmaides Romanoglu, since mothers of young babies have always priority. Yeah.
Just the debate, it might not last very long. Thanks. I have to use this, yes. Okay, all right. So I missed part of the discussion, I'm sorry. So you may have discussed this already. Oh, closer, okay. So yeah, again, I'm sorry if this is something you've discussed already, but as I was listening to your paper, I was thinking, well, there's something that I didn't understand about the Gorgias and the Protagoras view. I thought that you said that they might be evidence against Republic 4. Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay, so I may want to hear a little bit more about that. But to me, what I read in Republic 4 is very familiar from my reading of the early dialogues. I guess I think that that there are discussions of specific virtues in specific dialogues, and the virtues that do get discussed are the very 4 that come up in Republic 4. So But then again, I understand what you're saying about Republic 6, bringing up more virtues. So what's happening there? And I guess one thing that puzzles me, and I want to ask really, is Republic 4 says explicitly, these are the parts of virtue. Does it not? Isn't that, I mean...
It just says ta. It just says these are the four. Sorry.
Let me see it again.
427, it does not speak of, I mean, it says complete goodness. So
Complete
it's true. It is
goodness.
true.
Oh,
They're-
that's right.
they're
Oh, you're
part of-
right. You're right.
but
You're right.
it doesn't get nominalized as,
You're right. Okay,
Authoritative.
so then my argument won't stand, because what I was going to say is if these are the parts of, I guess, virtue, but here it says of the good city, I guess.
completely good city.
The completely good city, and perhaps complete goodness does not mean complete virtue.
No, I mean, why not? It means the
might,
same, whatever.
right?
I mean, I don't know what, calling it virtue, I don't think adds anything, but yes.
Okay, well, okay, so then if complete goodness or virtue is basically those four things, then here it does say these are the parts that we need and we don't need anymore. But is this said actually in Republic 6 is my question. Like, is there a similar claim there? Because if there isn't, then maybe these are not intended to be the parts of virtue that are the only ones to be found. Maybe there are relationships between those parts, between these virtues, as it were. So we call them virtues, right? We say, oh, these are familiar virtues in Republic 6. What if, say, generosity follows from justice? If you have justice, then you have generosity. And there are certain other relationships there that are not mentioned. You see what I'm trying to say? Okay, so basically these two things. Thanks a lot.
Good. Oh, yeah, okay. And actually, derivative virtues, I'm glad to talk about that because I didn't answer that question originally. Okay. So Gorgias 506-ish. So for last, the time when Socrates is talking to Callicles by talking to himself. Yeah. So there, Socrates goes through the same argument twice. The argument is about sôphrosunê. So remember, Callicles thinks it's fine to be intelligent and courageous, but just and sophron being those, that's not good. So Socrates gives this long set of arguments about sôphrosunê. And the argument culminates, in a way, with Socrates saying, so if you're sophron, then for that reason, you are also dikaios and eusebes, because being eusebes, or whatever, is being sophron, peri theon, and or theus, whatever, and being dikaios is being sophron with respect to humans. Oh, and not only that, you're also courageous, but that's built in as part of sôphrosunê, as somehow a part of, as it were, the overall being of being good in that way. This gets, and then in the Protagoras, you have a similar point where we're seeing sôphrosunê and sophia being, collapsed, sophia episteme or whatever being collapsed with courage, and so now it's sort of looking as though sophia or phronesis or whatever, that is the general category, and these others are, who knows what they count as, specifications, versions, certain inflections, or so forth. And this is the point I was making, I don't know if you're here when I was responding to Rachel, that I think it's quite like an interesting historical possibility that the terms we think of as the canonical virtue terms or cardinal virtues are just those virtue terms which could plausibly be seen to stand in for arete overall. That is, you could plausibly call someone good simplicator by calling them sophron, or dikaios, or sophos, or andreios in different contexts, for sure. And it would be difficult, perhaps, on this argument, to say to say Thanassis is eucharis, that's all he needs to be. So it's just like, because we get less of a kind of complete overall sense of a goodness from that. So I think throughout many of the dialogues, so this is a response to your second point, why are the dialogues about those big virtue terms? Well, because I think, again, as a historical matter, different point, I think there was proliferation of virtue terms in the late and early 4th century. This is clear from epitaphic evidence. It used to be you died, people wanted to mnemne you for, Henica arete, Henica sophrosunê. But then by the late 5th century, I don't know, cheaper rates or people are charging by the word, your inscriptions get longer and longer. You're remembered for more and more qualities. So, that's just one perhaps representative area. I think we see it in Gorgias' funeralation. We see it in Isocrates and Xenophon as well. In Agathon's speech in the symposium, you basically have more people more inclined to give longer lists of ways in which someone is good. And if that's the case, here's a kind of a hypothesis. Socrates is like, what's up with this practice? What's up with arete inflation? So you're telling me, Protagoras, that you go around teaching all of these virtues? That's impressive. You can teach 5 different ones? Yeah. No, it looks like you're really just teaching one thing or whatever. So I think what we see over time and time again is Plato depicting a certain mode of ethical theorizing that Socrates is quite interested in, and that is putting pressure on people just like starting to list and give independent reality to these various ways of being good. Anyway, that's a lot more than you needed to hear. Now, finally, about derivative virtues, I don't think that there's any argument for that, at least not in Republic, at the beginning of Republic 6. It's not like, well, you start with justice and you get, instead you start with not being stingy or petty, not with being analutheros or smikrologos. Oh, and therefore they're megaloprepes. And therefore, blah, 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 they're andreios. And therefore they're cosmios. And therefore they're hemeros. And so, of course you could, the history of medieval thought has a bazillion instances of people deriving all the other subsidiary virtues from the cardinal ones. But so what? I just want to be careful about retrojecting what people are trying to do in saving their Platonism from conflating that with what we actually have in the ethical debates of the early 4th century.
Okay.
Maybe I'll tell you later what I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Next one is Jessica Moss.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for a really interesting paper. In a way, my question is similar to Alexander's. Which was, well, could this be something about when we hear the 4 virtues in book 4, those are the virtues of the city. That's what makes a city good. And so we're not going to mention these others. I don't quite agree with the way that you put it, Alexander, because I think you said that the 4 virtues are ones that everyone in the city has, but that can't be quite right because wisdom is only for the guardians and maybe courage is only for the soldier.
Wisdom is the wisdom of the artisans subordinated to the wisdom of the guardians. They become douloi and philoi of the good person.
Okay, good. So the ones that would, I was just thinking something in that neighborhood seems appealing to me. Maybe I'm just trying to save the internal consistency of the Republic here. That the qualities that we find out about in book 6, those are really important qualities for a ruler to have. And I'm not now saying that something like their derivative virtues or anything like that, but just that there's somehow, even though wisdom is distinctive of rulers, somehow sharpness and retentiveness and memory are more distinctive in a way that doesn't make them virtues of a city. So would you say the good city is retentive? The good city has a good memory? Maybe that sounds weirder than saying that the good city is wise. I really don't have a good argument for how to spell out that difference, but it does seem a bit appealing to me. And maybe, I am worried that maybe if I tried to spell it out, it would fall back on something like sharpness and retentiveness. They're not really virtues. They're kind of instrumental to wisdom, or, they're helping virtues or something like that. But anyhow, I definitely did have some thought that there's city virtues and that's what we're looking at. And then we're going to translate those into soul virtues.
Yeah, that's nice. And thank you also for letting me respond sort of en passant to Alexander, which I didn't have a chance. there's a tension between what you said and this idea of transparency, like which now who brought up transparency? That is, why even refer to a city as Sophos or a city as Sophron? I mean, Sophron city, that comes up from time to time in Thucydides with reference to Sparta. There's a question, I think there's a serious question, whether those virtue terms are in fact transparent. I mean, if they claim that a city is Sophron, that means it's leadership or it's people overall, I think that's not very clear. But anyway, I mean, if we're saying like, why refer to a city's qualities as, or a completely good city as having these qualities? Well, the claim is, you know, oh, but it's not really a city, it's their leadership or it's their personnel. The reason why that's challenging is, I mean, I'm back to thinking like, well, what's the argument that those are the four, I mean, it's the argument that's the virtues of the four virtues of a city, as opposed to euporos, unomos, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, of course, I understand what the argument is supposed to be. That's somehow, they're somehow represented. I mean, do you see that though, I don't want to just give up and say like, well, obviously, those are the four virtues of, sorry, my brackets, you know, of that, and then the 11 are the virtues of the philosophical leaders. I still don't quite know what the four are virtues of and why it must be those four and why it's only those four, because I don't think that there's a sound argument for that, except for the general feeling that, sure, being Sophos is a lot more significant than just having a good memory or just being, you know, able to learn quickly. I mean, it's a much more capacious term. It, you know, being knowledgeable or being expert in some field or being expert in leadership, of course, that also has much vaguer, more indeterminate boundaries. And so I think it's easier to talk about that. And the precision matters if the method of finding the remainder is supposed to work. But I grant that there is something attractive about the idea of trying to say that there's a different object, or rather target. Now, I think there's a further problem, like whether it actually seems right to say that different people or different groups of people are going to be good in different ways. I mean, it seems like you're going to start running into some Meno issue. Well, but don't they have to be that way, sophronos and dikaios? You know, so of course you're going to then have an additional problem of, unifying your virtue terms. But the way that you've put it, I think, is very helpful to me.
Okay, sorry, I just see Alexander's texting saying he's leaving and he thanks you, and I should look at 590 C to D. I don't know if he's still here. But maybe I'll do that on my own time. But I'll let other people come in now. But yeah, thank you. And I don't have a, it's sort of a, not last ditch, but a somewhat desperate attempt to save the internal consistency of the Republic. I will just say for the record, there's something that does seem natural to me about saying it's a wise city and unnatural to me about saying that it's a city with a good memory or sharp-witted or something. And I'm not sure how to spell out that difference, whether it should be done something like the four cardinal virtues are the ones that are the intersection of the virtues of a good city and a good person. That's why he chooses them, but that wouldn't save the argument. But anyhow, yeah, thank you.
Interesting. Very nice.
Okay, thank you. The next one is going back here to Princeton Center is Dukas Kapandes.
Thanks a lot. I've learned a lot from, I'm rather ignoramus on this topic. But I had a broader methodological point, but I just want to focus on the Plato Republic or 400, the first passage. So it seems to me that it's genuinely ambiguous. So I'm not sure that the context settles the ambiguity. The question can be two things. First, if the way you read it, that meaning what are the conditions that imply the presence of a city which is completely good. And in that reading, then the conditions are shown by the enumeration that follows. But the other reading is reading on the assumption of, if we assume that the city is completely good, then necessarily these virtues should be attributed to the city. And this is a completely different sense. I mean, one can say this person is invested in every kind of asset there is to invest. And thereby, he's invested in gold, in real estate, in cash, in foreign currency. And this is something which is a sequitur. It does not exclude that there are other assets he's always invested in, which you do not mention. So I wonder if, I doubt if this ambiguity is settled by the context. And I also have another question, but I'll later, if there is time for the... So is this clear, the ambiguity in the passage? I mean, one can claim two things. If you say it's really been founded correctly, I suppose that our city, if it's really been founded correctly, is completely good, right? Your reading begs for the conditions of a city which is completely good, right? Am I right on?
Yes, so
yeah.
if I say
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
city is completely good,
Yeah.
therefore
Yeah.
it has these qualities.
Exactly. But the other reading is that on the assumption that the city is completely good, it has these qualities. It does not exclude, by being completely good, having other qualities too.
Right. But
and my example was along these lines.
No, I understand. But isn't that, sorry, I'm going to ask a question just to refine my understanding. So I take that to be consistent with the first inference. If a city is agathe, it is also at least sophia, andreia, sophron, and dikaia.
Right.
That's the first part. So that seems fine. So I'm totally cool with that. That's great. I mean, I still think it's weird. I mean, I wish we had time to talk about there being sophi polites. But, you know, if Socrates wants to say, like, yeah, you have a city that's knowledgeable, okay, fine. But the finding the remainder method is what, to me, puts the limitation on it, that it's the second inference that, and therefore, if we find three, we'll find the fourth. Because it strikes me, given the centrality in Plato's works, Republic, Meno, etc., of megalopropeia, and given the centrality in Xanthippe / Aristotle of either megalosoukia or megalonomosune, why not whatever's left over be mixed up, like a mixture of justice and this kind of generosity or open-handedness or dignity or something like that. I mean, you might say, like, oh, but we're not going to find that. But still, the method is suggesting to me that Socrates is seeing whether Glaucon thinks, yeah, we'll just stop at 4 virtues, and that is sufficient.
But this suggestion hangs upon the first kind of reading, that one is after the necessary conditions for a city which is completely good, and not something that follows from the assumption that a city is completely good. So, of course, it is, and it is consistent with that reading. But the other one is not excluded thereby.
Sorry, I'm sorry that I don't know whether I'd be able to give a helpful explanation beyond what I said. So, okay. I mean, either you could try again, or I'll talk about it later.
Okay, now I would like to give the floor to Hermione Prokopaki, and the next one will be Octavian Purik. Later, yeah, later. Yeah.
Thank you. Well, my question is in the same, the main vein we've been talking about. So, and specifically, why you seem to, well, I'll put it this way, you seem to downplay the role of the city-soul analogy in determining these, and more specifically, these four, I mean, and more specifically, that, I mean, I grant that it seems to come out of nowhere that these are the four we need to look for. That seems right. But it does seem that the ones we are looking for are the ones that have to be there for the isomorphism of city and soul and for the goodness of that isomorphism. And I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but that seems an extremely important part of the project of the Republic, why this isomorphism needs to be there. And so the presence of these four virtues in this passage seems really important, and in such a way that I'm resistant to accepting that it's merely rhetorical or like it could be anything. And that's my comment / question.
Good. So, so the first part is, I just don't know what the argument is that humans have four mutually exclusive and, mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive virtue parts. And so if we're trying to preserve, so it suggests to me that you're saying, well, so there's an isomorphism between the city and the soul. But the problem with the humans is that we've not shown that there's only four virtue parts to have, and that they're distinctive in a way that would be sufficient for doing the finding the remainder method. So that's one thing. The second thing is, it strikes me, my opposed intuition, is that if we really want a homology, it would be nice if the list of virtues of a city didn't sound so ad hoc. Like there's no evidence in any text written before the Republic that a city, like it's just natural to think that a city has these four qualities, like and those are the leading qualities, or whatever, or that the leadership would obviously distinctively exhibit those. So it strikes me that while it is quite regular to speak generally, informatively, of a person being excellent in terms of those four or five, or a different set of four virtue terms, that's fine. I'm saying there's indeterminacy there. There's no, I don't think there's any argument in any text of Plato that there are and only are four. But then also, if there's isomorphism, it would make me less suspicious if it was more, if there's better reason for thinking that if someone said, hey, you live in a perfectly good city. Which city is that? Oh, it's Athens. So your city must be knowledgeable, courageous, self-restrained or disciplined, and also just. I think it's like, I have never once thought about thinking of my city in that way. So I would like the isomorphism to be informative and not seemingly made up.
Okay, next one is Octavian Purik.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. You've persuaded me on a lot of points, but I still think there is an asymmetry between the virtues in Book 4 and those you've listed in Book 6. And I believe the root, let's say, of this asymmetry is found on the passage in 491 AB. There, Socrates lists or says that those who have philosophical natures and the virtues associated with philosophy are let's say, when corrupted, most able to do harm. Also in Book 7, intelligence, when it is directed at, let's say, bad ends, is most capable of doing bad. So basically what I'm going at is that it seems that the virtues in Book 6 are not sufficient for goodness. So, for example, if you take all the 4 virtues in Book 6 and replace them with sophia, you would not necessarily have a good city, right? Because a city can be keen, can be sharp, but it can be so in following ends that are not wise. So basically, maybe what the 4 virtues have in common in Book 4 are that they guarantee goodness, while the virtues in Book 6 are conductive to attaining these type of, let's say, good guaranteeing virtues. So that there is this type of disconnect between the instrumentality or neutrality. They have this pharmakon nature, the virtues in Book 6, and those in Book 4 seem to guarantee by themselves goodness. So this is my point.
Yeah, that's a nice idea. I mean, Laws 3 tells against it. I mean, that's a different book. But it suggests that it's at least an open possibility. So in Laws 3, or is it Laws 2? I think it's Laws 3, where, yeah, but you imagine someone who's sophos, but if they're not sophron, they might use it badly. Or you have someone who's dikaios, but they're not sophron, they might use it badly. So anyway, so at least we have in Book 3 of the Laws a kind of argument, which is that, it's not self-evidently true that each virtue part is always good. Obviously, Xanthippe takes up this argument in a different way. So, of course, in the year 379 or whatever, whenever this Book 4 was written, I mean, it's possible that Plato thought that, what's distinctive about andreia, by contrast with kosmiotes, or being hemeros, or megaloprepeia, is that the one is always good and the others are not always good. I mean, I don't know on what grounds he would say being megaloprepes is sometimes not good, but one can come up with grounds for all kinds of arguments like this, as we see in Laws and in Xanthippe, and so forth. The problem is, I just don't, I'm stupid about this. I just don't see an argument for that being the distinction. And if it's such a big deal that you're going to found, I mean, for instance, can I just say, like, if you read who cares about the Oxford Very Short Introduction to the Virtues? But if you did read it, you'd say, like, there are 4 virtues that are secular virtues, and then there's 3. The 4, they'll go back to Plato, because Plato said this. And now you say, well, who cares? Plotinus, blah, blah, blah. But again, the issue is that, I mean, that's a sensible possibility, I guess, but it seems like you would need an argument. And then I still just don't understand then why Socrates is all loosey-goosey and, sticks andreia in these, in the groups of the potentially bad virtue terms, why he refers to these other ones as parts of virtue, and so forth. So, I mean, I'm struck by this variety in the Republic, and of course, I want to unify as much as anybody, but I guess my inclination to unify another way. But I do appreciate your point, because it means that it reminds me how I am I lack good memory, because I didn't answer Gail's question, which is similar to your question about the nature's stuff. I mean, I started talking about it, but I can't reconstruct the text right now. But my sense is that the talk of natures at the beginning of 484, that is the beginning of Book 6, is to refer to a class, to this group of people. And that I don't see it as referring to how they need to be early on, where, though, as you get older, you sort of narrow the kinds of qualities that you have. So anyway, that's my answer.
Okay, thank you. Next one, Xanthippe. And,
Thank you very much for your talk. And it's been very interesting also the fact that you try to place all this discussion about the number of virtues in the context of contemporary discussion. So I understand that this is very, I think, important to locate Plato's discussion, but so maybe Book 6 is an indication that he's in such a context of discussion. Now, as to Book 4.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know, maybe somebody has already mentioned it. I think there is some necessity to derive 4 virtues and these specific virtues. So the argument shouldn't be so arbitrary in terms of method. Now, I think that the argument would be kind of complicated, perhaps, because we have to understand what each virtue, the nature of each virtue. But the necessity, I think, derives first and foremost from the fact that the soul has 3 parts. So the fact that the soul has 3 parts may be itself arbitrary and may be related to the effort by Plato to create a city-soul analogy. But the fact that we have 4 virtues, if I simplify the model, is as many parts of the soul plus 1. So it's very... Think about what justice is. Justice means that each part of the soul... I mean, that's a very simplified version. I think the version of the argument would be more complicated. But justice is a virtue of the whole, and it enables all the other virtues. So, why it enables all the other virtues? Because each part does its own. So, how each part is going to develop its own virtue? By restricting itself or by external factors to one work. So it develops the relevant virtue related to the work. All the other 3 virtues are related to the work of each part. That's very simplified because implicitly I say that sôphrosunê is a virtue of the 3rd part, but it's not only, but at least it's a virtue where it's the only virtue that the 3rd part has. So what I'm saying is the model on the context of Book 4 is that we find the virtue of each part and then we find the virtue that enables all 3 to work well, and this is justice. So there is some necessity in that.
I'm going to say there's some, here, I don't mean this personally, there's some casuistry, if not necessity. That is to say, sure, let's say there was 5 cardinal virtues. I think you get 5 out of the 3. If there are 3 cardinal virtues, I think you get 3.
I said 3 parts.
No, I know. But I'm saying when you have 3 parts, this is simply having 3 parts doesn't delimit how many possible relations there are. So you could imagine if there's 3 parts, there's 3 virtues. You could do a combinatorics, and you could say there's 3 parts, so there's 6 virtues. You could say, so here's the worry I have. It strikes me as a little, I mean, I could see the logic individually, but I can say, okay, so there's 3 parts. Individual virtues for part 1 and part 2. Then there's a virtue for all 3, sôphrosunê, and then there's a virtue for part 4, also all 3. And so, again, I mean, there's individual reasons given for each of them, but why not then, there's a 5th virtue that's also a different relationship between all 3, because there's a relationship between all 3 parts in both sôphrosunê and dikaiosunê, but they're different relationships between those 3. What limits us to there being 2 types of, interpartal relationships? So do you see? So it strikes me that though you can give individual arguments, there isn't a necessity relationship, because I could live in, Baulipolis, where there's 6 cardinal virtues, and I give this soul meteorology. and city mereology, where there's the three. There's the leading class and spirited class and the productive class. And I could easily give you an argument for the way that there are multiple virtues. So the point is that one can give an argument, but not say that it is the only possible argument that there is. And so this is the part of the project I said I wasn't going to get into. That is, because what you're picking up is a very powerful line of argumentation that you see in other forms. That is that there is a natural or necessary relationship between soul mereology and goodness mereology. And so, for instance, you have in early medieval period, you have the thought, well, you need to have, we think of ourselves as practical agents. You have the mind to make the decisions. You have the sôphrosunê to keep us away from the pleasures, the courage to keep us away from the pains, and the justice to give us the social coordination. That's an interesting argument. But again, you could say like, oh, but there's also megalopropeia because whatever, no one's going to interact with you unless you're like a nice person. And there's also megalosouphia because you're never going to get anything done if you're doubting your own qualities. Or there's also mnemes because you could be as smart as you want, but if you forgot what someone said to you yesterday, you don't have a kind of temporal continuity. So I guess I think that there's not natural restraints or necessary restraints in the number of virtue terms applicable to any psychic structure in a context.
Thank you. I think maybe the four virtues in city correspond to the structure of the discussion of different classes as literal or rhetoric method. Sophia, Sopho is the main character for philosopher king. And andreia, sophron and dikaia correspond to guardian because in Republic we read that a good guardian should practice at the same time gymnastic. Yeah, so gymnastic is like to character, to cultivate character, andreia. Yeah, and to practice art. Yeah, it's like to be sophron. And if they, sophron, and if they practice art and gymnastic together, it's like kind of dikaia. Yeah, and for book 6, they came more details. So maybe we can understand in this way. Thank you.
So you're saying that the book 6 gives more details. Again, I mean, the problem that I see is a problem of arbitrariness. I mean, that is to say, like, why not say that? Why not say that, for instance, the guardians need to be aphilokrematos? You know, that's really important, that they don't care about money, that they're not driven by money. I mean, that seems important. It seems somewhat different than being andreos or being andreioi. So there's, you might say, well, but it's more important that they're andreos. I mean, yeah, maybe so. See, part of the problem is that, again, I just think that you could choose any number of virtues and tell the same story. You can choose one. I mean, that's the one that I'm most impressed by. You could,
I think that lots
yeah.
of people are saying are making the same point, in a way building on each other, it seems to me. Like, because Xanthippe is, sorry to jump in here, but...
no one's going to be able to hear her.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess I was trying to say that it seems to me the last three questions are somehow related, and that maybe your last point was explaining what Xanthippe was trying to say earlier, that these four virtues are not randomly selected. Of course,
of course I don't think they're randomly selected. I think those are the most significant ones. But significance doesn't mean exhaustiveness. That's the primary point. It doesn't mean exhaustiveness, and also doesn't mean exclusiveness, such that the method works. I mean, again, what I'm trying to indicate is that I don't think Plato is arguing, or has given an argument, or is giving an argument that passes, that meets any of the canons of rational success, that there are exactly four virtues, parts of virtue, etc., that have these qualities. Despite his being thought to have done so by some, but not all people, and by many people in the contemporary scene. And I mean, many more people are satisfied than I am in thinking either he doesn't need to give an argument for his views, especially his really important views. I disagree, especially when I see something that's quite distinct from stuff he's writing about everywhere else, both before and after. So that's one thing. But I also think the fact that Socrates is, or we for Socrates can be giving reasons, post hoc reasons, for there being four, doesn't, as it were, speak to our having to think, oh yeah, there's a good reason, that Plato's providing good reasons for there being exactly four.
Okay, it is 2 minutes past the 8. If you don't mind, I would like to reserve a last question. Actually, I would like to come back to what Octavian Puric said, because I think it's important. Because on the one hand, in Book 4, we know that virtue is good. This is a core belief from Plato. Every virtue must be good. And what we see in the four, let's say, cardinal virtues in Book 4 seems that it is indeed something good. However, in Book 6, and especially in the passage that Octavian mentioned, 491 BC, he uses the same name as something that could be good, but also it could be bad. And let me briefly mention it. The most extraordinary thing of all that you'll hear of is that each one of the qualities in that nature, philosophical nature, which we praised, corrupts the soul, which possesses it and drags it away from philosophy. I mean, courage, andreia, temperance, sôphrosunê, and everything we discuss. That's what Socrates says, and then says, and the so-called good, the other virtues, the so-called good destroys like beauty, wealth, physical, etc. So it seems to me that, yes, here it is. So it seems to me that in Book 4, Plato uses the four names of virtue in a very strong philosophical and technical sense, while in Book 6, when he refers to the four virtues as well as to the other virtues you mentioned, he uses it in the way that common people in his era use it. So it seems something different. If it's not different, then we have to accept that Socrates and Plato contradicts himself. Or not. Maybe I'm wrong, I don't know.
No, I guess I don't understand what probative value is in this 491.
Well, the problem is that there, sôphrosunê, andreia, and the rest can be used for bad purposes. But this is impossible according to what Socrates described in Book 4. I mean, the term andreia is something like courage, something like, courage to do something good or something bad.
Yeah.
This is impossible according to the definition that Plato gives for andreia in Book 4.
That it's always good.
Right.
That is always good.
Yes.
And yet here, the claim is that it's not always good.
It seems so. Yeah, that's what Socrates says. Yeah.
And so, sorry, so
my point is that these terms, andreia, sôphrosunê, and also megalopreipia and doxine and all the rest, are something different, have different meaning than the meaning that the four cardinal virtues have in Book 4. I mean, Socrates used these terms here in the way that all the Athenians and the Greeks of his era used it. That's my suggestion. Okay, I'm not quite sure, but that's what I suggest.
Yeah. Okay. So you go from the same. I understand what you're saying. So sometimes sôphrosunê means one thing, and sometimes it means something else.
Right.
Right. And my view is that it's not a matter of being technical or not technical. It's that we have the same thing as I mentioned in the laws. You have a similar thing happening late in the Statesman, where sometimes, and you end up having in the definition of individual virtue terms, you sometimes are using the terms, or sometimes characters are using the terms in ways that are not fully normative, and sometimes they are fully normative. I wouldn't say that's a difference of technical versus non-technical, but an intrinsic fact of ethical language that sometimes you're emphasizing the behavioral aspects and sometimes you're not. And sometimes you're saying, like, behavior aside, we're just talking about the norm, namely, it's just, this is a term I'm going to use for a type of being good. And so anyway, but I mean, so it's quite helpful to see that because I think that fits the overall.
Okay, one very small.
This has to do with the unity of virtues, this passage. If we distinguish one virtue, virtues form a unity, like in Protagoras and in other places in Plato. If we distinguish a virtue totally out of the others, from the others, then maybe we can have these results that he says there. So we have to see in this framework of the unity of virtue.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, so this you see a nice example of this in the third pairwise argument in the Protagoras, when there's a question: can one do adikeia sophronos? And it's like, well, and Protagoras is like, yeah, sort of you can, sort of you can't. Sort of you can if you think of being sophronos as being, very driven toward one end. You can't if you think of being sophronos as being, cognizant of all the things it's important for a human to be cognizant of. And so this, again, is part of ethical language, that you have this switch. And I mean, this is like what explains why there's debates in the Platonic dialogues about the unity of virtue, because it's quite complicated to see how you could have something that is normatively pure, but also that has behavioral correlates, because we can often speak of those behavioral correlates as leading to bad ends. And yet, if you get rid of the behavioral correlates, then all the virtue names refer to the same thing, namely knowledge, which, I mean, is fine, but then you have some trouble in understanding how do what role do the behavioral correlates play in the various virtue names. So I think the problem that you identified is one that I don't talk about, and I think is a very central one in the overall schema, but I don't think that is providing evidence for the Book 6 stuff being per se, just behavioristic. Although it's I think it's a quite interesting possibility, one I need to contend with that, so I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much for this great talk. thank you all for being here, and I also would like to thank the Princeton Athens Center for the great hospitality here, and particularly Nancy for arranging all the logistics here. So, next talk will be in October 1st by Vasilis Karasmanis, and the topic is Dialectic on Plato's Republic. Okay, thank you, and